Khaya, thank you so much for your time. And of course, this particular report, and we listened to that package by Khaya Sithole and how you were reacting to, the SARB in this particular matter and what it's had to say. But let's start by explaining to our viewers who are watching tonight, what is a perfected transaction?
Good evening, and good evening to the listeners. Look, I think the English gymnastics are a bit of a problem here, but the simple explanation is that a transaction that has been completed in the terms of every single expectation between and the buyer has been met and executed, that would be what you call in essence a perfected transaction. In this instance, the use of the term is simply created to imply that there was still some outstanding conditions or some outstanding elements relating to the sale of, game farm from Phala Phala that were not resolved by the time the Reserve Bank engaged with the matter. So therefore, they've classified it as an imperfect transaction or unperfected transaction.
And one of the things, that is quite clear here, and I'm going to get to what you just said in just a moment about the completeness of this particular transaction. But the central bank says that the report will not be made public, not be made available to the public, as this is a private internal report. But one asks then the question, is it because they are oblivious to the public interest and how people have been keenly awaiting what they have to say?
No, they're not oblivious to the public interest dimension, because they do actually mention it in their statement as if that justifies why they felt obliged to tell us something. So, of course, the problem here is that the public interest dimension is quite wide in this matter, in the sense that when the story broke, we actually were one heartbeat away from a resignation of a president. So you cannot underestimate the public interest component of it. The secondary issue, of course, is that in a country that has undergone a grey listing process, you would have imagined that the South African Reserve Bank would regard it as important for us to have some sense of clarity about what exactly the rules of engagement are in relation to people who move significant amounts of foreign currency within and outside South Africa's borders. The failure to release the report denies us all of those insights into what the process of investigation would have been, what they would have considered, and also how they reached the conclusions that they've reached. And that's just in relation to the lack of information itself. On a more problematic stance, it is the inability for citizens to then reconcile the sum of the reports and the sum of the information that's already in the public domain from other structures with the conclusions that the bank has reached, because at the heart of their conclusion is the fact that, well, actually, since the transaction was not finalized, no one really owns the money. So therefore, no one really owns the money. No one has the obligation to report it within 30 days because they actually haven't become entitled to it. Now, that is obviously at odds with some of the conclusions that you've seen, where, for example, the South African Revenue Services says that this amount was duly declared as part of the tax affairs of this entity. And one would then have to figure out, well, what is the basis or what are the terms of that disclosure that the SARS was able to engage in versus what the Reserve Bank says hasn't happened. So it unfortunately creates far too many, arenas of conflict and confusion.
And also the other confusing part is that the actual person who brought the money into the country did not deny the fact that he came into the country with this money. Now, if they say there was no completeness, one is asking the question, should they not have also looked at the fact that this money that came in, what then happened with it? What were some of the regulations here? Because they continue to say that there were no violations in terms of the exchange control.
The problem here is also the question of who exactly the Reserve Bank decided to focus on, because you can imagine that if a foreigner says, look, I arrived in South Africa and clearly I did not declare this amount of money because we were told they couldn't find evidence of the money being declared at the point of entry. So obviously that person would have a case to answer on their own. In this case, if the Reserve Bank says, no, actually, this is a report relating specifically to the president and the farm, then that's really an element of selective myopia where they can simply narrow down the conversation to those specific elements of it and ignore the wider picture, or at least not engage us in how they considered the wider picture. So, of course, had we been able to access the report, we would have been able to figure out what the interactions were with the person who originally brought the money into the country. Because if the Reserve Bank is to reach a conclusion that this transaction is still subject subject to particular conditions, well, those conditions must have been conditions agreed to between the buyer and the seller. So it would be impossible to imagine that they only engage with the farm or the president's version of the story and did not corroborate that with the person who was a counterparty to the transaction. So, of course, if that person says that, look, I am entitled to these particular animals and all that's simply is missing is a matter of logistics, then that gets you as far as you can get to saying that the transaction is essentially concluded. What we then saw in the report today was a lingering impression that actually there are so many other things that are still pending in this transaction. It isn't a transaction at all.
But did it have to take them a year to get to this conclusion?
No, it couldn't have taken them a year, because if you think about it, what they have done is that they've said, according to Regulation 6.1, nothing happened. And Regulation 6.1 is quite clear. If there was no transaction that had been finalized to begin with on the basis that the animals had not left the farm, then it would have taken a matter of days to then say, well, actually, because we say under Regulation 6.1 that transaction has not been concluded, in other words, the 30-day countdown for the reporting obligations have not been triggered, then they should have been taken days to actually finalize. The problem, of course, with that proposition is that it flies in the face of what we had been told, because from the inception, everybody agreed. It was common cause that the animals had never left the farm. So that cannot be the type of process or the type of issue that the Reserve Bank takes an entire year to engage on. It was known from day one. So if they want to come up with a conclusion that says that because the animals never left the farm, there was no finalized transaction and therefore the 30-day countdown clock never started, then this is an issue that could have taken a year. It just doesn't make sense.
Do you think they'll be forced to release this particular report, maybe in one way or another, probably through a PAI application or not?
I think that there will definitely be attempts to try and force them to disclose it. And of course, given the enormous public interest component and also the political dimensions associated with it, all the political parties, the opposition political parties, will go as far as they can get to essentially pry open this Pandora's box. So of course, what we will then be able to see is at least the report and be able to then reconcile some of the information that's in the public domain versus the processes that the Reserve Bank undertook. And then only then do we then assess the merits, or at least the integrity of the conclusions that they've reached. So it will be a dual process where firstly the report has to be accessed, and only once the report is in the public domain and people are able to interrogate it, do you then explore the terrain of actually reviewing the report and saying perhaps a different legitimate authority like the courts may indeed reach the same conclusion based on the full spectrum of the facts rather than the narrow mandate that the Reserve Bank seems to have adopted.